entrepreneur, teacher, writer, and speaker, where he has led over a decade of becoming good soil intensives and sold out Wild at Heart men's events across the US, UK, South Africa, and Australia. Cheri is professionally trained in offering trauma-informed soul restoration and care through mindfulness and movement classes. She teaches students regularly at Mary's Home, the Navigators, the Classical Academy, and in private workshops through her organization, the Deeply Rooted Collective. Cheri is a teacher who leads alongside Stacey Eldridge at captivating retreats around the globe and is occasionally a guest teaching pastor at Discovery Church, Colorado. Morgan and Cheri, it is truly an honor to have you on the show today.
Reina, I've never been a Valentine's special.
No.
That makes me nervous.
Oh, it's truly my pleasure. And part of the reason that I invited you here on this Valentine's special is because the love that you two display for God, for one another, for God's children is unique, and it really shines God's glory to the world in such a special way, because you don't only get out there and tell people all the things that have worked for you and the tips and tricks to having a great relationship. You really get into the vulnerabilities of the times that you were having trouble, the times that you were just like all the couples out there who are looking for this kind of advice, and how you made it through with God's guidance, and how you've seen different couples throughout the decades help make it through to have a wonderful relationship, the kind of relationship God created us to have, rather than the relationship that, you know, we kind of see two things out there in the world. This fantasy that everything's going to look like Cinderella and Snow White and happily ever after fairy tale that stops right at the wedding, right? We never see past that. Or the, you know, you really should just be realistic. Your relationship's going to look like sitting on the sofa watching Netflix, and that's all life has to offer, you know? And so we see these two extremes, and one's just totally unrealistic and the other is not very appealing. And I feel like many of this generation has just lost hope that love even exists. And so I really commend you for going out and showing people it exists. It doesn't look like this, but in so many ways, it's so much better, so much deeper, so much
tolerate the uncertainty of Morgan's fluctuations of mood, and being able to sort of stay present to that, depersonalize it, and give him space. And so I was compulsive in my movements toward him, as opposed to coming from a place that was rooted in God's love for me, maturing a bit more and able to move toward him, not out of compulsion, but out of a genuine, like, is there anything I can do for you? And my well-being is not at stake, whether you say yes or no.
Yeah, Reina, I think that often in Christianity, we hear much about the category of salvation. And salvation is a really big reality of coming to a confident, trusting place of our soul under God's care and in genuine connection. But what we don't hear about as much is its salvation and restoration. Like Paul has this fascinating statement of we are saved and we are being saved. And one of the things we've learned is that the path and process of becoming wholehearted requires salvation and ongoing restoration. And so to understand that there are different ages and parts of us that actually get arrested, they get stuck and they fail to grow, a lot of that is out of trauma. And just a perspective from a masculine perspective, I became a follower of God and his kingdom in college. And it was a radical conversion, I would call it, where it was moving from the self-life to a genuine confession and trust and confidence in God. For you, of just,
you know, before we get into the example, I do want to touch on that just a little bit more, because your book, I recognize it so much because my book talks about it too, is, you know, being under the image of God and remembering whose we are and whose image we were created in. You know, you go into it a lot in your book where we think we're, you know, just a sinner saved by grace versus, you know, being God's beloved child made in his image. And I think what, you know, you're kind of talking about with these young parts is sometimes we think, okay, the after college guy, he's, in God's image sort of, but I still have these other parts, but we haven't brought that all the way through the traumas.
Yes.
And recognizing, I say in my book that I believe the first sin was not eating the fruit. I really believe the first sin was that they forgot who they were, because if they would have done like Jesus did later and said, I already am like God. He breathed his very breath like me and made me in his image. Get away from me, Satan, like Jesus later would in the temptation. We would be reading a completely different narrative. And so, I really do think we need to recognize who we are. And I hear you saying that that we need to do that, not just for now, not just for the moments ahead, but even for the moments behind where we have these wounded places. We need to bring this knowing you are also God's beloved child, made in his image, who he's well pleased with, even in that failure or that trauma or whatever it was that is leading to maybe this reactive behavior now. And when we can do that, helps us to come out of a responsive place.
And I think we underestimated how much our young places were going to show up in our marriage. And in fact, we can now see through the eyes of faith and rescue that was, it's like baked into the plan. Like all of a sudden we have this intense proximity to each other. And so the young places are, boy, activated, exposed,
nowhere to hide.
How should I say? Just like really, really present. And what happened for me though, Reina, that I grieve is that I heaped a lot of self-hatred on myself. Like, what's wrong with you? You shouldn't be so like, I knew that this wasn't I knew this wasn't mature relating to Morgan. And instead of immediately being curious, I started with contempt. So this dug me down into a depression because I offered contempt for this young place in my heart instead of curiosity.
And Reina, we've learned it's just a practice. Like to grow and mature takes practice. And an example of that, for years, Cheri was so patient with me and trying this exercise where she'd say, Morgan, I'm inviting you to be with me and listen to me, not as my husband, but as my friend. I just need you to be my friend right now. And I'm thinking, what the heck does that mean? Like, I'm your husband and like, let's get to it. Let's get the problem. Let's figure it out and let's fix it, which doesn't work. Okay.
No.
After 20 years, I've learned. But the invitation was to be known, as you're saying, I'm inviting you to know me. And we've learned this mutual practice and process of coming to the center of each other's experience, not to fix, and not even to fully perhaps understand in the moment, but simply to accept them, to reflect back to them of, this is what I hear you saying. And so we would do an exercise where she would say, for example, just as my friend, I want to share, like, my husband is leaving for another trip and he's going on an adventure with his friends. And I'm grateful for his time to be with his buddies. And I know he'll come back encouraged and strengthened and be better.
It's interesting, just in my own life, I think I've been on both sides of this move toward, when you two were explaining it in the podcast, I really felt like I'm generally a move against, but maybe later now, and I used to be more of a move toward, but I've been on both sides of it, where I've been the one kind of like needy, like, I need you to tell me that this is okay and we're okay and I'm okay and I'm enough. And then I've been on the other side of it where, a man is like, are we good? Are we good? Are we going to get married? Are we going to, I'm like, whoa, hold your horses, buddy. Like, let's just, and so I've been on both sides of that. And I like what you're saying though, about being known and being graceful with each other's young places, because it doesn't make, for me, when it was on a man's side, it was like super annoying. Like, why are you needing me to affirm you? But then when I was, when I was the person, I was like, I need you. So if there's grace in those situations, though, where there's a seeking to, okay, what are you really feeling here? This need to make sure everything's okay. What's the deeper, and understand that someone's not this moment alone, that it, the fear isn't directly because of you or to annoy you, or, I like the idea of getting to know each other's brambles, getting in there together, and then go take a rest and retreat.
And so it's just an example where life is madness. Everyone's moving, more and more, faster and faster. That's the culture in which we
Yeah.
live. And so we have to get practical. Peterson says, if it's not practical, it's not biblical. Like, that's a bold statement. But we have to move from big heady ideas and theology to practical application. So I think that's an example in our everyday life where we really become students of each other's heart, but even, Reina, as you alluded to, students of their story. Yes, a practice in listening. And so often when we are with a person, we're actually not listening because our energy is put towards what we'll say, our reaction, our response. And so in this, it's 5 minutes of I'm listening and then reflecting. And then the next 5 minutes is Cheri is listening and reflecting. And so, yes, it's a really healthy
the
practice.
Privilege of proximity, simply the privilege of having him share his story with me. With it need to be nothing more than the practice of honoring that is a gift received, a gift given.
A gift entrusted with, right? We
So
don't trust everyone with our stories.
It doesn't have to be strategic in any other way. It's and what I notice about that is it causes a hush as opposed to an act.
A little bit, both in individual and in marriage, how we need to tune into that spiritual warfare and recognize it's there. I think it was C.S. Lewis who talked about, the only thing worse than getting overly focused on demons in that realm is pretending like it doesn't exist.
And to what measure? So in our marriage, I think, and I'd love to hear your reflection, my intensity, there's nothing I dreamed of more than being a father and being a husband. It's all I ever wanted. And I wanted to lead and love a woman. And so this intensity to come through and be a man and be a hero in our marriage.
I can imagine, because I believe that you didn't, it wasn't like a dysfunctional relationship where someone's actively like poking at you and trying to hurt you. It was in his love, he was smothering you, right? In his intensity of trying to make things great, he was caging you. And then you wanting to be the love and the goodness toward him, you have to say, I know you mean well, and it's also doing this to me.
And we're not yet, but we're not who we were. And so we just celebrated 20 years of our marriage.
Wow,
and so
congratulations.
It was amazing. And we had these moments where we didn't know if we'd make it. And we had moments where we have hurt each other very deeply. And even in the last 6 months, but here we were at 20 years and just in awe of what God has done and how he's healed and how he's restored. And I think if I could say anything to our friends that are listening or watching, like, what we found is the major theme in God's kingdom is breakthrough. The major theme is restoration and renovation and transformation. The major theme is there is more than we could ask for or imagine that is available. And that's not to minimize the loss and heartbreak and struggle, but the major theme is restoration and breakthrough.
But we've been both stuck in these bird cages, right? And a lot of marriages are suffering. I think, sometimes in the beginning of the pandemic, it was like, oh, you're home. Yay, we get some more time together. And then as people settled into the actual, okay, now I'm working on Zoom, I've figured out how to do my work schedule. I'm actually kind of working more because we're figuring this all out. And now I also don't have a separation of church and state. Like there's no separation of home and work. And so it's all bleeding into each other. And we just don't, we don't know how to function in this. And we have to figure it out together, and we're going to hurt each other because it's all new landmines we haven't excavated yet and allowed God to come in and give him consent to excavate this new thing. So talk about, even after 20 years, even after leading dozens and dozens of couples, maybe hundreds between all the ministries, maybe thousands, to wonderful restored relationships, you find yourself, in a pandemic, still finding new landmines to hurt each other with. To talk about that, because I think maybe some people out there, in this pandemic phase are finding, okay, well, my marriage just doesn't work because I've seen in these last 6 months the true person and it's not good, rather than that grace of, there's some unhealed parts that being stuck together has shown us.
It's COVID year, and
Yeah.
we said we want to reflect on the new year, and we want to do it by looking back rather
I
than
love
just
that.
asking God for advanced words, which we do, and
Mhm.
think towards the future. We put out our pictures from the year, and they're mostly digital. We pulled them out and we asked the question, what is God like based on who he was in our life in this past year? And so look at the pictures, remember the stories, and
Yes.
what is God like? And how do we trust then confidently that's who God will be as we move into this new year? And so, like a simple activity, Joshua, our son, he looked through his pictures of football was canceled, lacrosse was canceled, that youth group retreat was canceled, everything was canceled, and yet there were all these other adventures and life hacks and kingdom opportunities that came up as well. And in all of it, he said, what I learned, God is the one thing that's reliable.
Process. Like, how can someone begin to make 75% complaining turn into 75% celebration?
Yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts and on this. I think it's important for both of us. I think for me, one of the big things that Cheri's modeled in our home that was huge is a culture of forgiveness, of really having a culture where we are quick to say, I'm sorry, I was wrong. Will you forgive me? And I love you. Like a simple exercise of begin with, I'm sorry, like I was wrong. I take ownership rather than here's where I was right and here's what needs to be fixed. It's I'm sorry. Keep my side of the street clean. Here,
Yeah.
I'm going to own what is mine that's shaping this situation, this problem. And I think it's really created a gracious culture of really owning my stuff and room for other people's hearts and opinions and perspectives and voices to be heard. So that's one piece.
Is we also do have a question of what are you grieving? And so I think for us, what are you celebrating? What are you grieving? As a practice of being known.
Yeah.
And but again, we're 75%. We're curious, we're wanting to spend celebrating, but acknowledge that grief. And then I feel like the Holy Spirit gave me a picture that has given me a lot more courage in those seasons where, there's Catherine May in her book Wintering. She's a poet, but she just talks about sometimes in those seasons where things aren't going well, you suddenly feel like you are in a winter season when everyone else is in a summer season, and in those seasons where our marriage seemed like the ice age had moved in, and it's easy to look and compare
Yeah.
other people who seem like they're in a summer season where they're, there's a, it's easy, I think, for me, it was easy to go to despair of this ice age is going to be forever. And what I felt like the Spirit said is, I want you in these things where you're grieving where you've harmed him, where my style of compulsive move toward has harmed him, where his move against has harmed me. When we were needing to do some grief, the Holy Spirit said, like, picture our marriage as this plot of ground, and to grieve with gusto, to trust that every tear was watering, replenishing the space, and that harvest would come, and she who sows in tears is going to reap with joy. So if for any of the listeners where they're like, my marriage is an ice age, I don't even know if it's ever going to melt out, and that if there are things to grieve, may you be blessed to grieve with gusto, to know that those tears are generative in that soil, and that the day will come when you will reap a harvest from the hard work you're doing.
But there's times when that's acceptable, and times when maybe it's time to go get a counselor or coach or a therapist to help us through that pain, because not all pain, I would say, is even safe to go through ourselves. God didn't call us to be alone. It's the first thing, God said, this is good and this is good. Not good for man to be alone. So I want to encourage anyone out there who needs, seek out a counselor or a therapist or a coach, because these are really helpful. Even if you have to pay $140 to get kicked between the legs.
The joy comes in the morning. Sorrow lasts for a night. Joy comes in the morning. Kindness of a father saying the best things in life take time. Nature teaches us that. It's meant to be our first sacred text, that the best things in life take time. And so we chose to settle in to our marriage after we were rushing for everything. And instead we said, we choose to live in the day and measure in the decade.
Yes, definitely tune into the deep-rooted _ collective. Is that correct?
Thanks. Deeply rooted _
Deeply rooted.
collective. And then deeplyrootedcollective.com.
Perfect. Definitely tune into that, because we all, I think, especially as a church, need to remember that our bodies, these created temples to harness the soul that God has breathed into us, are really good things, and we can tune into what God's showing us in our body. So definitely check out Deeply Rooted Collective, check out Becoming Good Soil, check out Becoming a King. All of it. There's just so much, and you can be with us for hours and hours. We encourage you to join us. So we thank you so much for tuning in. And until I see you again, may the Lord bless and keep you, cause his face to shine upon you, and nourish your soul.